Welcome to the Cygnal Pulse Pod today, joined by Cygnal pollster Mitch Brown, and we'll be talking about the March survey, national survey that just came out of the field, 1,500 likely voters, and 2026 general election voters. So already looking ahead to the midterm. We're going to cover 6 top takeaways in this episode, and then pick some winners and losers in a lightning round at the end. So let's jump right in. The issue that kind of defined the 2022 election, which was threats to democracy. It was something we actually didn't even include on a lot of our surveys in 22 because we thought it was a dumb issue. But what it really is a dog whistle for Donald Trump. But they just call it something else, threats to democracy. And we've now seen that rise here in March to the highest point that we've ever tracked, that going back to the beginning of the 22 or the end of the 22, beginning of the 24 cycle. It's all the way up at 22% as an all-time high. So now it's the number 2 issue. What is your take, Mitch, on what's driving that right now?
One, if you break it down, I think it's important to see that these are people who don't really have much concerns with anything else. They're higher income earners. It tends to be more women. It's kind of a luxury to be in this camp. It's also people who would be selecting other things that were never going to change their mind. These are people who would say abortion. These are people, again, who thought January 6th was a true insurrection planned by the president. It's a lot of people who don't really have any other issues to care about. So it's going to rise. This is the anti-Trump vote. When you go look at it in congressional races where we've tested in 24, where we didn't test it in 22, you can see that it's not as impactful against a traditional Republican as it is for Trump.
Well, I dug into a few of the numbers from the February survey to this survey of who moved to threats to democracy. Independents +9 on threats to democracy. Unmarried men, which I thought was a really interesting group, and I'll mention them in a couple other sections here too. That was a segment that was really good for Donald Trump in the election, and now you've got +8 of them moving to threats to democracy. Older voters are a big driver of this. If you go look at the heat maps on our deck here that's available on our website, it's almost negligible of people in under 55 moving to threats to democracy. It's almost exclusively over 55.
Yeah, this is boomer heaven. They love this.
But then you go look at inflation as the top issue, which it's still kind of maintaining in the 30s as the top issue. You've got people who switched from Donald Trump or switched to Donald Trump from the 20 to 24 election. They moved even further into inflation and economy as the top issue by +6, Hispanics by +5. So some really key demographics that drove Donald Trump's victory. They're saying even more now that inflation is rising as a top issue for them.
I think a lot of that's due to from them moving from immigration, with immigration kind of moving downwards as again, the apprehensions at the border at an all-time low. We're enforcing the border more. The deportation flights have re-begun. So I think a lot of people are moving from there to that. And how many times did we hear that refrain again from focus grouping during the general election, that there's a lot of people who didn't like Donald Trump, but they felt like their pocketbook was a lot better in 2019 than it was in 24. So it's a lot of these people, that's why they chose to vote for Trump. It was a simple economic decision. And so for them, they're going to need to see that structural change.
So how much do you think that Trump's actions on border security are leading to this drop in, now it's like a somewhat distant third top issue of illegal immigration and border security?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it is people too just thinking, okay, the Trump team is going to handle this completely differently than the Biden team. It might not even be like what they're seeing today. They're just not extremely worried about it anymore because it's not what was said before. They know it's not someone who supports open borders. So they say, okay, this issue is going to be resolved. We trust the Trump team on at least immigration alone. So it's moving down with those people. Now they're going to focus their eyes on something else.
Yeah, it's actually at the lowest point since December 23 in our tracking. So let's move to the next section here. We did a survey in the Gulf region at the same time we were doing this survey. So we surveyed Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates because we just got back yesterday from Dubai as a team. And you can watch the special episode of this where we talk mostly about those. But we ask a lot of questions that kind of help us get a view of how do Americans look at what's going on here versus how do they see what's going on abroad. And, you know, when you look at the direction of the country here, it's at our highest level. but then you see it's only 27% believe it's improving globally. How do you square that up?
I would classify myself as one of those. Again, I'm optimistic for what the next 4 years holds here, but when you look at the globe, when you look at what's going on in Europe, it is not reflexive of the traditional Western values anymore. And it's regions where we've been in combat, where we've sent troops, where we've invested in aid, and we haven't seen anything get remotely better. So people are concerned about what that looks like for the future. Is there anyone who can control it, or is that what it is moving forward? So if I was answering this, I would say I am not too optimistic about what the future holds worldwide.
Well, but when you dig into the U.S. specifically, because we have seen an improvement and it's kind of stabilized into right direction, wrong track. I dug into this group who switched to Donald Trump in the 24 election, and they had a net negative 15 movement just from February to March in how they view the direction of the country. And you know, when we get into Trump's image and his job approval, it's even worse among this group. So how do you see that playing out with this large focus right now, it feels like, on international issues? It doesn't feel like we're talking as much about domestic issues in March as we were at the beginning of February.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's going to come back to people understanding what Trump's done. It's been, so from the first, when we did this in February, that was essentially a week post inauguration. Trump really hasn't done anything yet at that point. Now we're seeing this is done after a month of him essentially holding the office. People are hearing what the counter argument to Trump's tariffs are, all these other deals that he's working out internationally. I think it's going to take time for this to see that this is the strategy of Trump, and so that domestically we aren't going to see this negative impact that people are saying we're going to see from the tariffs long term. But I think it's more so just that's something that they're going to have to move over time with, where right now the counter is just this is chaos, instead of seeing, okay, this is chaos for a reason.
Yeah, chaos for their good.
Yes, and that again, these are the threats to get the things done. Everyone can write their stories, but a week later, it's already changed. The tariffs removed, or there's a new deal in place. It's just having to understand that is what is going to keep happening for 4 years to rewrite these deals.
Yeah, totally agree. So there's a dichotomy between Trump's international policies, such as negotiating with Putin, and how that was all viewed prior. So we had it at 48% support of negotiating with Putin. How do you see that?
Again, I think that's about as good as you're going to get in this country. And it shows just we've painted Russia as the only threat for the past 4 years. The Biden administration was not focused on China or Iran. And if you look through this survey, their negatives or image for Americans is almost the same as it is for the Russians. All three of them are over 75% disapprove or unfavorable opinion. I think for the Putin negotiations, it's one of these things. We've seen this over 2.5 years where every section of America, except honestly for the boomer generation, we've seen people that have moved against foreign intervention in aid. That's something we've seen with Democrats. Ukraine over time, every single time it's surveyed, the support for funding Ukraine in this war has gotten lower and lower and lower. And people want to see it over. Trump ran on this, saying he was going to negotiate with Putin and come to a deal. People want to see that through. There was a subsect of voters who that was something that they wanted to see. Someone who went and said, I'm going to do this. Let's see him do it. And I think people still want that. That's why we're at this almost majority support level.
Yeah, the images are really interesting, especially when you compare them to the Gulf region where we did the survey. So Russia only has 11% favorability here in the States. It's 52% in the Gulf region. China, 7% approval here. Iran, 7%, 32% in the Gulf region, which isn't shocking because it's mostly Sunnis in that area. And then China, 13% approval here of American voters, 69% in the Gulf region. And like when we were just in Dubai this last week, there were Chinese cranes and construction sites everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's where the dollar comes from too. When we're talking about it, it's kind of a joint effort worldwide against U.S. oil. Like OPEC related and BRICS related countries tend to see eye to eye. And when we were there, even walking around, a lot of Russians there too.
Tons.
Post the start of the war, they've been vacationing there. Wealthy Russians, middle class Russians are not going to Europe anymore. They don't feel as comfortable. They've been investing in the Middle East, and we saw multiple Chinese buildings, multiple Russian buildings. And when you're out on the streets there, that's where the tourists are coming from, is China and Russia.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the piece of a lot of these newer, younger voters, and we see this globally too in our research, is that the media calls it isolationism. And I think that we as younger voters would say it's just kind of a resetting of America's role of making sure we take care of some domestic stuff, but not totally ignore the international. So we said, we asked a question about what should the U.S.'s role be in supporting and advancing democracy globally. And less than half of Americans, 43%, believe we should take the leading role in promoting democracy. 38% suggest a more supportive role, which I thought was really interesting. I mean, it's when you combine them all, it's a big number that at some scale and level, most Americans believe we should have some sort of role. But what did you see in the data there?
I think this, again, goes back to consistency of what we've seen over time. It's been a long trial of this post-World War II. This has kind of been America's regime operations. We've wanted to become interventionist and get involved and try to either, one, install a pro-Western democracy, or say that we're fighting for democracy in these places. In one, America's got nothing in return. But pre-World War II and I guess pre-Vietnam, we used to do this similarly with the Belt and Road Initiative. Call it that, but that's how we would get things back from these countries. We'd
the
get
Dulles brothers.
Yes. If you're gonna be an interventionist, be the Dulles brothers. They got a return for the American people there. What we've seen in the past 40, 50 years is getting nothing back. We've sent trillions of dollars overseas. We've sent a bunch of young boys to go die for causes that we abandoned 10 years later. People don't want to see that ad hoc. We are not the world's police. That's become a very common thing. The left was saying that for 50 years. Now it's almost like it's split down the middle, where both party has about half of them that don't want to be interventionists, another half does. It seems like the center right and the center left are more uniform in the belief that America is there to instill democracy worldwide and that they are the ones doing it and we have to police everyone. But younger generations are moving towards both sides of the populist wing. They want to see investment in their country before they see investment other places. Our country's deteriorated, the jobs have deteriorated, the housing market's deteriorated for young people. They want to see that fixed before we even talk about investing in other places.
Well, I think you saw this in the German elections too that just happened, where AfD on the further right picked up the largest vote share by far from their past election. BSW on the left.
Yep.
They believe a whole lot of the same things. It's kind of like Bernie bros and Trump bros having a lot in common. And then you had the SPD, which was the center left, that kind of did collapse, and the CDU barely picked up anything, and everything just kind of shifted to the ends. And we see that here too in the States. So this finding of 48% of voters supporting Trump negotiating with Putin, and even though you got 69% of Democrats opposing that approach, like how do you square that up with what we're seeing in the data here on that topic?
I mean, that's a win and as big of a green flag for Trump as possible. 31% of Democrats are supporting negotiating with Putin. That's a win issue. If you're hitting over 25% with the opposing party on any issue, that's a win. That gives you the green light to go do it. Because there is no counter option. No one is going to want the alternative, which is this goes for another 4 years. There isn't, unless we go and do this. This is the one counter to it where we have to be the powering force. Is this will stay unless we pull funding and disassociate completely. There is no other alternative here. So people, again, want to see that done. They want the funding stopped. And the only way to do it is to negotiate.
Well, and 81% of Republicans support Donald Trump negotiating with Putin. And so as you're looking at this data and you're trying to understand what is Donald Trump doing, why is he doing it, you see some really huge numbers from his base where he has nothing to lose. As we've said for a long time here, elections are not about persuasion. They're about persuasion to turn out. And so you've got to find those issues that your base is in the upper 70s, lower 80s on, and just drive that message home, because you got to keep them engaged. You got to keep them paying attention and being supportive, because you want them to show up in the next election, which is a huge risk. I mean, the generic ballot, for example, was Republican +1 in February, and it's already dropped to Democrat +1, which is, again, not a huge movement, but also in a single month, that is actually a a pretty big movement. And I think a lot of that is these low propensity voters actually just not even answering our surveys because they are not intending to vote in the midterm. They're like, what's a midterm?
They voted for their change. They said, Trump, go do it. Again, maybe we'll see them in 4 years, but those people aren't. Again, we're going to see it in a couple days or a couple weeks in Wisconsin. Will any of these Republicans show up in that Supreme Court race? It's hard to, because the Democrats are now enthralled to go vote. They are super polarized against what's happening. So they're going to have zero turnout issues there. The Republicans, how do you get one of these people, again, when we talk about these younger voters that care about the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, it's tough for them to even understand that the election's going on is an uphill battle.
Yeah. So going back to the international piece, because we asked about NATO and the UN, their favorability. And I think you and I were talking about this in prepping for this, that number used to be like 2/3 of voters had a favorable opinion of NATO. And now it's dropped into the mid 50s.
Yeah. This is kind of going into my winners and losers section, but globalism is the biggest loser of this survey. Anything that relates to the word world stage, Americans are no longer on board. Again, all of these things used to be unanimous. Even we went and looked while we were in Dubai of what the numbers were historically. And even post NATO bombing in Kosovo, they had a higher image than they do now, significantly. And if you go back to the Iraq War days, 2004 through 2007, before it really started to turn negative in the media consumption of it, NATO was favorable. The UN, the past 5 years, has lost all credibility. People on the right who've been following it for a while, China's involvement on the Human Rights Commission there, it's basically made all the UN null and void. It's there for no reason. And all these groups that once were tools of Western power seem to just want to take away Western power and criticize America. People don't want to be involved in these organizations that we don't have any say in anymore. And so when you go through all of this, none of it is good. UN, NATO all look terrible.
Well, look at the Republican numbers on this. You've got 37% of Republicans that have a favorable opinion of NATO. 31% of Republicans have a favorable opinion of the UN. And that's like the holdouts of the highly educated Republicans that have stuck with us and not actually gone to the Democratic Party yet. It's just really fascinating to see those numbers so low. So then, how do you think these international stances affect Trump's popularity and his policy decisions he's making?
And I think this is where he has room to grow and isn't as hurt. I think it's domestic things like DOGE where he's getting the harm coming from. And it's a hard optic view when people see, 40,000 jobs are being cut at the VA, or they're going at Medicare. This is what's coming out and being told to people, even though it's not the case. That's where he's losing ground here. People know his stances on all of these foreign issues. He's been saying this for 5 years. He ran on these things, criticizing NATO, criticizing the UN.
He said it in the 80s when he sat down with Oprah and first talked about, he's been talking about China since the 80s.
Yeah. And in the USAID thing, people can try to spend, no one cares about federal workers or NGOs outside of this 15-mile radius around us here.
Yeah.
No one else cares. NGO effectiveness on this, 39% people think it's effective. So good luck getting people to not like Trump over him shutting down the outrageous NGO funding in this city.
I think Trump is a honey badger when it comes to international affairs, and that is why he actually works so well in that realm. I looked again at these switchers, the people who moved from either Biden or not voting in 20 to voting for Trump in 24. They have dropped, and I think to your point, it's more on the domestic issues. But he's had a 29-point drop in his image with these voters, that a 24-point drop in his job approval with these voters. And it's a lot of these non-male or these male non-college voters. And so what we've been saying for a while is there's got to be some conversation on the economic aspect of what Trump promised he was going to do, because it feels like he's really delivering on a lot of the international things that he said he was going to do. He and Elon Musk, whose image has dropped also even further in this most recent poll, they are doing what they said they would do on government spending, but it kind of feels like not as much as being at least spoken about in the media of what is he doing on the economy and inflation.
Yeah. Again, this is one where they're going to have to make it felt for people to change this. These people want the economic change. Until they feel it, they're going to feel like they were lied to or didn't get it. So again, long term, it's bringing down the inflation. I think the Trump team needs to drive home like the lower gas prices at the lowest that they've been since March of 21 this week.
Egg prices down almost $3 a dozen right now.
It's keep doing that and the tide will turn. It's these people need to feel, and that takes a while for people to understand that and actually feel that. I do think the other part too is a lot to do, and it's not covered as much because it's harder to quantify. But the housing market, the housing shortage, it was something JD Vance was talking about the other day, and what cities need to do for growth, because the rent situation and the purchasing a home situation is also a large part of this. It feels so unattainable. The job market, it's a lot of these things that take a long term for a large group of people to economically feel. But to kind of bring it back to that, Trump can do all the things he's doing internationally, but when you go home and you're sitting there and you don't have enough money to go to the grocery store and get everything you used to, it still doesn't matter.
Well, the Wall Street Journal this morning had an article talking about how people are buying smaller packs of Doritos, smaller packs, and as it gets closer to the end of the month, they're buying smaller and smaller quantities and smaller ticket prices, total receipt prices. And the housing thing is really interesting because I really respect Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who has interjected himself and essentially said, we need to focus on driving down the 10-year Treasury rate. This is not about the stock market doing well, because, I mean, how many people are actually invested in the stock market?
I was reading the stat the other day. 90% of all domestic-owned U.S. stock is held by 8% of the population. The other statistic, about 39% of people have any money in the stock market, but 8% are only people who actually feel the brunt impact of the NASDAQ and Dow going down.
Yeah, there was another journal article today that mentioned that now everybody's feeling the anxiety. And I think what it is the top 10% of the population under the Biden administration were flying high with these asset prices, just rising and rising and rising in the value of their home, in their stocks. They were doing really well under the Biden economy, but it was because we were overspending by $2 trillion a year or more during his presidency. And so, this is a detox period, as Lutnick said.
I also think it goes back to the principle of a lot of these companies and why the market is down are things that are relative. Most of these digital companies don't actually produce anything. Google's intrinsic value, all these companies, Facebook, Meta, whatever group you want to put in there, they were crashing. They don't have a GDP-based value. And so what people are going to feel in America, those swing voters who moved to Trump, us restoring GDP as the end-all, be-all for the American economy instead of what the ticker says, is going to actually bring those voters back to us. They're going to feel that it means more jobs, it means more cash in their pocket. I do think what they're talking about on the Hill today and what the Trump team was talking about, I believe Lutnick went out and said, is that Trump wants to remove tax for anyone earning under $150,000 a year. That's a massive initiative. Again, having that group that needs the economic recovery get that could seismically shift this.
That seems like a really big promise to have to pay for.
Yes.
That's probably $1 trillion right there. I'm not a economist, but so let's finish before we go to the lightning round here with how Trump was approved on the various issues. Because you've got inflation, he's actually upside down and how he's handling that at -16. Economy and jobs better at -4. Immigration, this is his rock star issue, +16 approval. I mean, just huge. Even Democrats approving of this. Government efficiency, I thought this was really interesting. This was net even. And so as you look at, the conversation around Doge and how people are saying that, the sky is falling again, I think that is the people in the media, and that is the people here in the Washington, D.C. area, that their hair is on fire on the topic. But when you go ask Americans, how is Trump doing on government efficiency? The fact that it is net even, I think, is a huge positive and shows how disconnected this area and the elites are from how folks feel about the issue. Here's something really interesting, how he's handling the transgendered issue, +2%. But when you go look at the folks who switched to Trump, In 24, 71% approval on this issue. It was actually the second highest after immigration among the switchers group. What's your take on that?
And there was very targeted advertising at the end of the campaign in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan about this issue. This is one of those three that we identified midway through 24, where you can go further to the right and not be punished by independent voters. Even, again, I forgot what the exact percentage was of how many Democrats were supporting this, but especially when it comes to children, people saw what Trump did with banning men from women's sports. They want this away from their children. If it came down to just banning it overall, I think he'd start to have a little bit more pushback with this group. But people want any of this away from their children desperately. And we saw that in Pennsylvania when we did the project for APP. This is what helped move people. And it helped move people who weren't culturally conservative before. It's not like again, we had to move a bunch of people who were pro-life, pro-whatever. These are people that got moved on this issue because they saw it in their communities day to day and thought it was absolutely insane. And he's going to have as much leeway with this as possible.
Well, I'm actually writing a book right now on this topic. And the premise is that the cultural issues actually drove more people to Donald Trump, especially in these non-white communities, than the economic issues did, because they felt like something could actually be done on that topic easily. Fixing the economy is such a massive thing that people probably don't even believe that Donald Trump can, within a year or two, fix the economy, because it's like, how do you even wrap your mind around it? But on this topic, we just released a poll too with the American Principles Project in Georgia, where Senator John Ossoff, along with I think 44 other Democrat senators, voted essentially to say, yes, men, you can go play in girls' sports. And in this Georgia Senate poll, it was 44-44 of Trump versus a Republican candidate. We didn't even name a Republican candidate, which is a bad place to start out. You can't even beat a nobody. You're tied with a nobody. But then when we said, if you knew John Ossoff voted to allow men and women's sports, 52% for a Republican candidate, 38% for John Ossoff. I mean, a 14-point swing on this cultural issue. And I think that's one thing that as Team Trump and Republicans specifically down ballot, because I think the Republicans down ballot are scared to talk about this issue. I mean, how many conversations did you have in the 24 election where you're like, our message map shows that this men and women's sports issue or genital mutilation of children for sex changes before they're 18 were the top issues by far? It would actually switch somebody to voting for a Republican. Trump had no problem talking about it, but it still feels like some of these down ballot candidates are a little scared to jump into the issue.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they should be ultimately embracing it. It's simple when you think about it, though. If you said this stuff 15 years ago, people would have thought you were crazy.
Yeah.
Like actually psychotic, maybe institutionalized, because thinking, no, we want this man competing against my daughter in a sport. That's still how the public views it. For some reason, the Democrats got in their mind that this has to be out at the forefront, that they are going to promote this as the most inclusive thing possible, and that they should actually be campaigning on this.
Yeah.
I think obviously now in retrospect, some people on the left have been talking about how this went too far, but if you asked people too in our surveys, they thought that was a top 3 issue for the Democrats. Like, is that was one of the things they cared about most.
Right.
Inflation was nowhere near the top. They really, really cared about making sure men could transition and use the same bathroom as your daughter. And still, the majority of American people think that's absolutely crazy.
Well, and what's crazy is they're not transitioning. They just want to be in the bathroom with girls. So let's do winners and losers, lightning round. Mitch, what's your winner? What's your loser based on this poll for March?
There really isn't that many winners. You could say Trump has the carte blanche to still do what he's doing internationally. But he lost sentiment for his image, and Republicans lost on generic ballot. But Democrats, if you look in the House, their image didn't get any better.
Yeah.
Biden's image didn't get any better. So there's no one who's like a clear winner here. Again, the losers, I can list many. Like I said, it's everything that was the status quo 15 years ago has lost. People feel like that did not bear the fruit that they were promised it would be. So international groups, NGOs, UN, NATO, all lost on this survey. I actually don't think that the images were that surprising. This is probably what Putin or Chinese leadership, Iranian leadership would think that their image would be here. It's not really a loss for them. If anything, it shows that American people understand what's going on, but don't really want action. So when it comes to winners, you're not left with many. You're left with keep doing what you're doing internationally, but Trump needs to come back and figure out how to, one, advocate exactly what they are doing to make economic life simpler and easier for people. Until they can do that, which is probably going to take a few months for people to actually even feel that.
Or even a year
impact.
or more.
Yeah. That one's going to be tough. So again, when it comes to the winners, do you have one? It's hard to really say.
I think it's Trump's domestic non-economic policies are winners. And I think he actually needs to lean more into this culture war because it shoves Democrats into this 20-25% pool of the electorate where they look insane compared to the other 70-75% of folks who are normal. And that will actually give him air cover to let the economy do what it needs to do by slashing government and driving down the 10-year T-bill rate and these other things that are going to be painful for people who own stocks, but actually benefit the other 90% of Americans in even the short term, but especially in the long term.
So you think that we should be getting, in all races up and down the ticket, getting a stance from the Democrat on trans issues, kind of how like every Republican was forced to say something about abortion.
Yes.
Here it's like, okay, what are your beliefs here? Should we be transitioning children? Should their parents have to even know about it?
Yeah.
Should they be competing against men?
Or in California, you can take the kid away from the parents if you don't transition your 7-year-old.
Yeah, because you're seeing the first few like politically savvy Democrats come out and say the things they should be, like Newsom and his podcast that he just did with Charlie Kirk.
Rahm Emanuel came out.
Rahm Emanuel, Seth Moulton from Massachusetts. There's been a few who've come out and said that again, until we see that from everyone, like this should be a question that should be posed to all Democrats up and down the ticket.
Yeah, let's put them on the spot.
Yeah.
And I think that buys us cover for this election cycle to let the economy get to a point where it can actually recover from 4 years of just horrible mismanagement. And my loser is Biden for one, mismanaging himself, the country, and the entire Democrat brand, which you can see still is not recovering. He's only 40% favorable, 55% unfavorable.
Yeah, again, I don't think he'll ever recover from that. I mean, you see people who had ultimately, George W. Bush, when he left office, his approval rating was abysmal. That's kind of recovered. I don't think Biden's going to be viewed very favorably in the future. I think a lot of it was the cognitive decline. I don't see how his image is ever going to rebound.
Yeah, agreed. Any final thoughts on the implications, findings of the poll?
The other one, again, I do see a little bit of trouble spot is how long can Elon Musk be like palatable to the American people? I think that's my biggest takeaway from this is I think he had starting from when he became visually in the White House doing this, I think a year is the top amount that he could spend there before that's going to be the midterm play. If he's still running around the White House beginning of next year, that's going to be every single campaign ad.
Yeah, I agree. Because back in December, we had him at 48% unfavorable, 45% favorable, and now he's underwater by 11 points. And it's just kind of a slow growth of not even just picking up unfavorability, but losing some of the Republicans.
And I don't think I think they're fine doing what they're doing, like eliminating the programs there. I think it's an Elon thing. It's become a lot about him and not about actually government efficiency.
Yeah. I think another implication that I see in this is that Republicans are going to have to start paying attention to the midterms. You know, we can't just sit here and say, okay, we've got the presidency, we've got the Senate, we have the House barely. And let's just let Trump do his thing. Like, I'm all for letting Trump do his thing, but any Republican that's on the ticket in 26 needs to start thinking about, how am I going to get this new Republican base? How am I going to go build relationships with them so that they're willing to come out and vote for me? Because you're seeing this drop in the generic ballot. Yep. And they need to start figuring out what are the issues we're going to run on to put the Democrats in that 20-30% bucket on that any given issue. I think the cultural issues are the ones that we need to lead with on that. So thank you for listening into our second national Pulse Pod video version, or if you're listening on podcast, and definitely check out our special episode that we did live from Dubai, talking about our survey of the Middle East, specifically the Gulf region. and stay updated on X or whatever your preferred social media is, but not Blue Sky because we're never going to get on that with the pedos, is at CYGNAL, our name. Well, Mitch, thanks for joining us this month.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.